The insurance investigator was sitting in my living room when I noticed the bruises on my arms had started to fade. 2 weeks since the fall down the basement stairs that should have killed me. 2 weeks since I'd opened my eyes in the hospital to find my son Marcus hovering over my bed with tears in his eyes and concern in his voice, asking the doctors when I'd be well enough to come home. The same son who had insisted on carrying my laundry to the basement that morning, who had suggested I might want to check on those old Christmas decorations stored down there, who had made sure I was wearing my smooth-soled slippers instead of my usual non-slip shoes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The investigator introduced herself as Detective Sarah Chen, a woman about my daughter's age with sharp eyes and a gentle voice that didn't match the gravity of what she was investigating. She sat on the edge of my floral armchair, the one Richard had bought me for our 30th anniversary, the one Marcus had been eyeing lately with comments about how outdated the furniture was getting. Her notebook was small and leather-bound, the kind that suggested she took her work seriously, that she paid attention to details other people might miss. "Mrs. Patterson," she began, using my maiden name even though I'd been married for 38 years. "I go by Mrs. Coleman now," I corrected her, though after Richard's death 6 months ago, the title felt hollow like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. She nodded and made a note. "Mrs. Coleman, I'm here about your recent accident. Your son filed an insurance claim for your medical expenses and ongoing care needs, but there are some inconsistencies in the documentation that require clarification." Inconsistencies. The word hung in the air between us like smoke. I shifted in my wheelchair, the one Marcus had insisted I needed, even though the physical therapist had cleared me to use a walker. My left leg was still weak from where I'd landed, twisted and trapped beneath me at the bottom of those wooden stairs, for nearly an hour before Marcus had found me. At least that's what he'd told the paramedics, that he'd been out running errands and came home to find me unconscious. But I remembered differently. I remembered his face at the top of the stairs, just before I fell, not concerned but watchful, calculating. I remembered the way he'd stood there for what felt like forever before finally calling for help, his voice carrying that practiced panic people use when they want to sound upset but aren't quite feeling it yet. I remembered thinking, as consciousness faded, that something about this felt wrong, planned, inevitable in a way that accidents shouldn't feel. "What kind of inconsistencies?" I asked Detective Chen, though part of me already suspected what she might have found. Marcus had always been meticulous about details, the kind of person who researched everything thoroughly before making decisions. When he'd decided to become a financial advisor, he'd spent months studying for his certifications, practicing his sales pitches on Richard and me until we could recite them ourselves. When he'd bought his house, he'd toured 47 properties and made spreadsheets comparing mortgage rates, property taxes, and neighborhood demographics. This same attention to detail had served him well professionally, but lately I'd noticed it extending to areas that made me uncomfortable. He'd been asking detailed questions about my insurance policies, my medical history, the value of the house Richard and I had paid off 15 years ago. He'd offered to help me organize my financial documents, had suggested I might want to update my will since Richard's death, had even brought me brochures for several assisted living facilities, just in case I ever decided I didn't want the responsibility of maintaining a house alone. The detective consulted her notes. "Your son submitted a claim, stating that you fell due to poor lighting and a loose handrail. However, our inspection of the basement shows that all the lights are functional and recently replaced, and the handrail is securely fastened with new screws. Additionally, the medical report indicates injuries consistent with a fall, but the pattern suggests you fell backwards rather than forwards, which would be unusual if you were going down the stairs normally." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Marcus had been in the basement the day before my accident, ostensibly to check on a water leak that turned out not to exist. I'd heard him down there for hours, moving things around, the sound of his toolbox opening and closing, the whir of his electric drill. When I'd asked him about it later, he'd said he was just tightening up a few loose things, making the basement safer for me. Such a thoughtful son, always looking out for his aging mother. "There's also the matter of timing," Detective Chen continued. "The claim was filed within hours of your accident, which suggests it was prepared in advance. Most people don't have the presence of mind to handle insurance paperwork so quickly after a traumatic event. They're usually focused on medical care and recovery. She was right. I'd been unconscious for the better part of 2 days, drifting in and out of medicated sleep, but Marcus had apparently been busy. He'd filed the insurance claim, contacted a lawyer about potential premises liability issues, and somehow managed to have my basement professionally photographed for evidence. When I'd asked him about all this activity, he'd told me he was just being proactive, making sure all my bases were covered, that I shouldn't worry about any of it because he was handling everything. The same way he'd handled Richard's funeral arrangements without consulting me, choosing the most expensive casket and burial package because he said Dad deserved the best. The same way he'd handled selling Richard's car while I was still grieving because he said it was just sitting in the garage taking up space and losing value. The same way he'd been handling more and more aspects of my life since Richard's death, always with reasonable explanations, always with my best interests supposedly at heart. Mrs. Coleman, Detective Chen said gently, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I want you to know that your answers are confidential. Do you feel safe in your current living situation? Has anyone pressured you to make financial decisions you weren't comfortable with? Have you noticed anyone showing unusual interest in your assets or insurance policies? The questions felt like tiny explosions in my chest. Safe in my living situation. I lived alone in the house Richard and I had bought as newlyweds, where we'd raised Marcus and his sister Elena, where we'd hosted countless family gatherings and holiday celebrations. It had always been my sanctuary, but since the accident, it felt different. Marcus had installed security cameras for my protection, he said, but they made me feel watched rather than safe. He'd given himself a key, because what if I fell again and couldn't get to the door? But I'd noticed him letting himself in at odd times, going through my mail, rearranging things in ways that suggested he was looking for something specific. Elena lived in Portland with her family, too far away to visit regularly, but close enough that Marcus could tell her carefully edited versions of my condition that made him sound heroic, and me sound helpless. She called every few days, full of concern about my recovery and gratitude toward Marcus for stepping up. She had no idea that her brother had been pressuring me to sign documents I didn't fully understand. That he'd been suggesting I might be happier in a community where I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining a house, that he'd been painting picture of my future that looked more like confinement than care. I think I need to tell you something, I said to Detective Chen, my voice barely above a whisper. But I'm not sure how to prove what I'm saying. She leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging. Sometimes people know things they can't immediately prove. Those instincts are often worth investigating. Why don't you tell me what you're thinking? Marcus had been planning this for months, not just the accident but everything that came after. He'd been researching my insurance coverage, asking pointed questions about my mental acuity, documenting instances where I'd forgotten appointments or misplaced keys. Normal things that happen to everyone, but he'd been treating them like symptoms of decline, like evidence that I couldn't be trusted to make decisions for myself. After Richard's funeral, Marcus had suggested that grief might be affecting my judgment, that I should consider giving him power of attorney temporarily, just until I felt more like myself. When I'd declined, he'd started documenting every small mistake I made, every moment of confusion or forgetfulness, building a case for my incompetence that he presented as concern for my well-being. The accident was supposed to be the final piece of evidence he needed. A serious fall that demonstrated I couldn't safely live alone, that required extended recovery and ongoing care, that justified moving me somewhere he could control my environment and, more importantly, my finances. The insurance money would cover the costs initially, but eventually, he'd need to liquidate my assets to pay for long-term care. The house, Richard's life insurance, the small investment portfolio we'd built over decades of careful saving. All of it would flow through Marcus as my guardian and financial manager. But I hadn't died, and I hadn't sustained the kind of debilitating injuries he'd probably hoped for. I was hurt certainly, and weakened by the trauma, but my mind was clear, and my recovery was progressing faster than he'd anticipated. I could see the frustration in his eyes when I exceeded the doctor's expectations, when I insisted on physical therapy instead of accepting the wheelchair permanently, when I started asking questions about the insurance claim and the legal proceedings he'd initiated on my behalf. Detective Chen made notes as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. Her questions were precise, but not judgmental, designed to elicit information rather than influence my responses. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding the situation rather than simply processing another case file. "Mrs. Coleman," she said when I'd finished explaining my suspicions, "these are serious allegations. If your son deliberately caused your accident with the intent to file fraudulent insurance claims or gain control of your assets, that would constitute multiple felonies. Are you prepared to pursue formal charges if our investigation supports your concerns?" The question terrified me. Marcus was my son. Despite everything I suspected about his motives and methods, he was still the baby I'd brought home from the hospital 34 years ago, still the little boy who'd crawled into my bed during thunderstorms and insisted I read him one more story before sleep. How do you accuse your own child of trying to kill you? How do you reconcile the love you've felt for someone with the growing certainty that they see you as an obstacle rather than a person? But Richard's voice seemed to echo in my memory, something he'd said during one of our last conversations before his heart attack. He'd been worried about Marcus's financial situation, about some business investments that had gone badly, about credit card debt and mortgage payments that seemed disproportionate to his income. Richard had suggested we might want to revise our estate planning, maybe set up trusts that would provide for the children without giving them immediate access to large sums of money. I'd thought he was being overly cautious, but now his concerns seemed prescient. "I need to know the truth," I told Detective Chen. "Whatever that means for my relationship with Marcus, I need to know what really happened in my basement that day." She nodded and closed her notebook. "I'll be conducting a thorough investigation, including interviews with medical professionals, insurance adjusters, and anyone who had access to your home in the days leading up to your accident. I'll also need to examine your son's financial records and communications, which will require a warrant. This process may take several weeks, and I want you to know that once it begins, there's no guarantee where it will lead." After she left, I sat in my living room and tried to process what I'd just set in motion. The house felt different now, charged with possibility and danger. I'd just accused my son of attempted murder and insurance fraud, crimes that could send him to prison for decades. If I was wrong, I would destroy our relationship and possibly his life. If I was right, he had already destroyed both, and I was simply acknowledging the reality he'd created. That evening, Marcus arrived with takeout from my favorite Chinese restaurant and flowers from the grocery store, his usual offerings when he planned to discuss something I wouldn't want to hear. He seemed more cheerful than usual, almost buoyant, and I wondered if he'd received some encouraging news about the insurance claim, or perhaps found a buyer for something he'd been trying to sell. "Mom, you look better today," he said, arranging the flowers in a vase with practiced efficiency. "The color's coming back to your cheeks. I think this wheelchair is actually helping you conserve energy for healing. Maybe we should consider making it a more permanent arrangement, for your safety." I watched him move around my kitchen with easy familiarity, opening cabinets and drawers as if he owned them, serving dinner on my plates with an air of proprietorship that made my skin crawl. This was my home, my space, my life, but increasingly it felt like I was a guest in it while Marcus played the role of benevolent host. "I've been thinking about your recovery timeline," he continued, settling into the chair across from me with his own plate. "The doctors say you're doing well, but I'm concerned about you being alone so much. What if you fell again? What if something happened and I wasn't here to help? I've been looking into some options that might give us both peace of mind." Options. The word had become a euphemism in Marcus's vocabulary, a way of presenting predetermined conclusions as choices I was being allowed to make. He'd used it when discussing Richard's funeral arrangements, when suggesting I might want to simplify my financial affairs, when proposing various changes to my living situation that all seemed to result in him having more control over my circumstances. "What kind of options?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. "Well, there's Meadowbrook Gardens, about 20 minutes from here. Really beautiful facility, more like a resort than a nursing home."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Independent living apartments with full kitchens and private bathrooms, but with medical staff on site 24 hours a day. They have a shuttle service for shopping and medical appointments, organized activities, even a library and computer center. You'd have your own space but wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or emergencies. He'd clearly researched this thoroughly, had probably already toured the facility and spoken with their admissions staff. The way he described it made it sound appealing, almost vacation-like, but I'd visited enough friends in similar places to know the reality. The independent living apartments were small and sterile, the activities were patronizing exercises designed to keep residents occupied rather than engaged, and the medical staff were overworked and underpaid, treating residents like problems to be managed rather than people with individual needs and preferences. More importantly, moving to Meadowbrook Gardens would require liquidating most of my assets. The entrance fee alone was nearly $200,000, with monthly charges that would consume the remainder of Richard's life insurance and my Social Security within a few years. After that, I'd be dependent on Medicaid and whatever family assistance Marcus chose to provide, which meant I'd be entirely at his mercy financially. I'm not ready to make that kind of decision yet, I told him. I'm still recovering. Still figuring out what my limitations actually are. I think it's too soon to make such a drastic change. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell I'd learned to recognize over the years. Marcus didn't like to be told no, didn't like to have his recommendations questioned or his timeline disrupted. As a child, he'd thrown tantrums when things didn't go according to his plans. As an adult, he'd learned to mask his frustration behind concern and logic, but the underlying impatience was still there. Mom, I understand that change is scary, especially at your age and after everything you've been through, but waiting too long to make these decisions can limit your options. Meadowbrook Gardens has a waiting list, and the financial terms are locked in for current applicants. If you wait 6 months, a year, the costs could be significantly higher, and there might not be any availability. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Act now or face worse consequences later. Accept his solution or risk being left with no acceptable alternatives. It was the same technique he'd probably learned in sales training, creating urgency to overcome customer resistance, but it felt grotesque when applied to his own mother's living situation. I need more time to think about it, I said firmly. And I'd like to visit some facilities myself, maybe bring Elena into the conversation. This is a big decision that affects the rest of my life. Elena's in Portland, Mom. She can't be running back and forth every time you need to make a decision. And honestly, I'm not sure visiting these places in your current condition is wise. You're still recovering, still dealing with mobility issues. It would be exhausting for you and potentially dangerous. He was systematically eliminating my ability to gather independent information or seek outside perspectives. Elena was too far away to be helpful. Visiting facilities myself was too dangerous. My current physical limitations made it impractical to research alternatives. Every avenue of independent decision-making was being closed off, leaving me increasingly dependent on Marcus's guidance and recommendations. But I had something he didn't know about. That afternoon, before his visit, I'd made several phone calls. I'd contacted Elena directly, not to worry her with my suspicions about Marcus, but to let her know I was considering some housing alternatives and would appreciate her input. I'd called my lawyer, the one who'd handled Richard's estate, to schedule an appointment to review my financial situation and legal options. And I'd called my doctor to request copies of my medical records and to ask specific questions about my prognosis and capabilities. Most importantly, I'd called my old friend Margaret, Richard's sister, who lived in Denver but had always been someone I could trust with difficult conversations. Margaret had raised 4 children mostly as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident. She'd dealt with financial pressure, family manipulation, and well-meaning relatives who thought they knew what was best for her. If anyone would understand my situation and provide objective advice, it would be Margaret. These conversations had given me a different perspective on my circumstances. Elena was shocked to learn about the insurance investigation and immediately offered to take time off work to come help me navigate the situation. My lawyer confirmed that I had no legal obligation to accept Marcus's recommendations about my living situation and that power of attorney documents required my voluntary, informed consent. My doctor assured me that my cognitive abilities were unimpaired and that my physical recovery was progressing normally for someone of my age and injury severity. Most significantly, Margaret had listened to my concerns about Marcus without judgment or automatic family loyalty. She'd asked pointed questions about his financial situation and motivations, had encouraged me to trust my instincts about the accident, and had offered to come stay with me during the investigation if I needed moral support or simply wanted an objective observer in the house. Marcus was still outlining the advantages of Meadowbrook Gardens when my phone rang. I recognized Margaret's number and answered immediately, partly because I wanted to speak with her and partly because I was curious to see how Marcus would react to my conversation being interrupted. Margaret's familiar voice filled the room. "I've been thinking about our conversation today, and I've decided to come visit. I can be there tomorrow afternoon if that works for you. I thought maybe we could spend some time together, maybe visit some of those facilities you mentioned, just so you have someone with you who isn't emotionally invested in the decision." Marcus's face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, irritation, calculation, and finally a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected outside family members to become involved in what he'd been treating as a private matter between mother and son. "That sounds wonderful," I told Margaret, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. "I'd love to have you visit, and I think your perspective would be really valuable." After I hung up, Marcus was quiet for several minutes, processing this development and probably reconsidering his timeline. Margaret's involvement would complicate his plans significantly. She was sharp, independent, and had no financial interest in my decisions. She would ask uncomfortable questions and provide alternative viewpoints that Marcus preferred to avoid. "Aunt Margaret's coming to visit?" he finally asked, his tone carefully neutral. Yes, she thought it would be nice to spend some time together, and she offered to help me research some options. I think having family input is valuable for decisions this important. Of course, absolutely. Family input is definitely important. It's just that she doesn't really understand your current situation, your medical needs, the local resources available. She might not be able to provide the most relevant guidance. He was already working to undermine Margaret's credibility, to frame her involvement as well-intentioned but unhelpful. It was a preemptive strike designed to limit the influence of her perspective on my decision-making process. But Marcus had miscalculated. The insurance investigation, the phone calls I'd made, Margaret's planned visit, all of these developments were creating a network of oversight and accountability that he hadn't anticipated. His carefully constructed narrative about my incompetence and his devoted care was about to be examined by multiple independent observers, and the inconsistencies Detective Chen had identified were just the beginning of problems he would need to explain. That night, after Marcus had left with promises to check on me the next morning and reminders about how much easier things would be once I was settled somewhere safe and appropriate, I sat in Richard's old recliner and tried to piece together the full scope of what my son had been planning. The basement accident hadn't been improvised. It had been preceded by months of preparation, groundwork designed to establish my declining capabilities and his increasing responsibility for my well-being. He'd documented my minor memory lapses, had encouraged me to rely on him for tasks I could have managed myself, had gradually taken over more aspects of my daily life, while framing this encroachment as helpfulness. The accident itself had been carefully staged. He'd ensured I was wearing inappropriate footwear, had created a reason for me to go to the basement, had positioned himself to be the helpful son who discovered me after a suitable delay. The insurance claim had been prepared in advance, with photographs and documentation that supported his version of events while obscuring the evidence that might contradict his story. The aftermath had been choreographed as well. The wheelchair I didn't need, the security cameras that felt more like surveillance than protection, the gradual introduction of assisted living as the inevitable next step. Everything had been designed to create momentum toward a conclusion that would leave him in control of my assets while appearing to act in my best interests. But Richard had taught me to pay attention to details, to question assumptions, to look for patterns that might reveal underlying motivations. He'd been a careful man, methodical in his approach to problems, and he'd passed those qualities on to me even though I hadn't always recognized them as strengths. The same attention to detail that Marcus had relied on in planning his manipulation was now working against him as I began to see the careful construction of his deception. Detective Chen called the next morning with an update on her investigation. The basement inspection had revealed some interesting findings, she said. The handrail that your son claimed was loose had actually been recently reinstalled with new hardware, but several of the screws had been deliberately loosened just enough to create instability without being obvious. Additionally, we found scuff marks on the floor that suggest furniture or equipment had been moved recently, possibly to create obstacles or change the lighting patterns. More significantly, she continued, we've discovered that your son has been experiencing severe financial difficulties that he's hidden from family members. He's facing foreclosure on his house, has defaulted on several business loans, and has been using credit cards to maintain his lifestyle while searching for ways to generate quick capital. The timing of his increased involvement in your affairs corresponds directly with the escalation of his financial pressures. I felt vindicated and heartbroken simultaneously. My instincts about the accident had been correct, but the confirmation meant accepting that my son had been willing to seriously injure or kill me for money. The child I'd raised, the man I'd been proud of, had calculated that my death was worth more to him than my life. There's also evidence of insurance fraud, Detective Chen added. Your son submitted claims for medical equipment and services you never received, and he's been in communication with several assisted living facilities about your placement before your accident occurred. We've obtained warrants for his financial records, phone records, and computer files. If our investigation confirms deliberate intent to cause your accident for financial gain, he'll be facing charges of attempted murder, insurance fraud, and elder abuse. Margaret arrived that afternoon, bringing her no-nonsense energy and decades of experience dealing with family crises. She took one look at my setup, the wheelchair, the security cameras, the way Marcus had rearranged my living space to emphasize my limitations rather than support my independence, and her expression grew grim. This doesn't look like someone helping you recover, she said bluntly. This looks like someone preparing to convince others that you're incapacitated. We spent the evening reviewing the timeline of events since Richard's death, the gradual changes in my relationship with Marcus, the increasing pressure to make decisions about my future based on his assessment of my capabilities. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly letting me work through the story chronologically. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes. Finally, she looked at me directly and asked the question I'd been dreading. Ruth, do you really believe Marcus tried to kill you? The words hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back once spoken aloud. Believing it privately was one thing, but saying it to another person made it real in a way that terrified me. I think he created a situation where I could have been killed, and he was prepared to benefit from my death if that's what happened, I said carefully. I don't think he necessarily intended for me to die, but I think he intended for me to be seriously injured enough to justify taking control of my life and my assets. Margaret nodded slowly. That might actually be worse than intending to kill you, she said. At least murder would be a crime of passion or desperation. What you're describing is calculated, ongoing manipulation of someone he's supposed to love and protect. It's sociopathic. The word landed like a physical blow. Sociopathic. My son, the baby who'd cried when his pet hamster died, who'd insisted on giving his allowance to homeless people we encountered downtown, who'd called me every week during college because he missed our conversations. How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with evidence of such fundamental callousness? Over the next few days, as Detective Chen's investigation progressed, the extent of Marcus's deception became clear. He'd been planning this manipulation for nearly a year, since shortly after Richard's heart attack when it became clear that I would inherit significant assets. He'd researched assisted living facilities, insurance fraud techniques, and legal procedures for gaining guardianship of incapacitated adults. He'd even consulted with a lawyer about the most efficient ways to liquidate real estate and investment accounts for someone with cognitive decline. But he'd also made mistakes, the kind of errors that revealed his underlying contempt for my intelligence and his overconfidence in his own cleverness. He'd left digital trails of his research, had communicated about his plans through channels that could be subpoenaed, had assumed that emotional manipulation would be sufficient to overcome any inconvenient evidence or testimony. Most critically, he'd underestimated my capacity to recognize what was happening and take action to protect myself. He'd seen me as a grieving widow, isolated and vulnerable, easily manipulated through guilt and false concern. He hadn't anticipated that I would seek independent advice, question his narrative, or have the courage to pursue an investigation that could destroy our relationship and potentially send him to prison. The confrontation came when Detective Chen arrested Marcus at his office, in front of his colleagues and clients, with charges of attempted murder, insurance fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. He called me from jail, desperate and angry, demanding that I drop the charges and claiming that everything he'd done was for my benefit, that I was too emotional and confused to understand his motivations. "Mom, you're destroying our family over a misunderstanding," he said, his voice alternating between pleading and accusatory. "I was trying to protect you, to make sure you were safe and provided for. Now you're listening to outside agitators who don't understand our situation, and you're ruining my life over an accident." "It wasn't an accident, Marcus," I said quietly. "And you weren't protecting me. You were positioning yourself to benefit from my injury or death while appearing to be the devoted son." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Marcus's defense attorney tried to portray him as a concerned son making difficult decisions for an increasingly incompetent mother, but the evidence was overwhelming. The staged basement scene, the premature insurance claims, the financial documentation of his desperation, the digital trail of his research into fraud and guardianship procedures. Most damning was a recording Detective Chen had discovered, a phone conversation between Marcus and his business partner, discussing how much money could be generated from liquidating my assets once he gained legal control. I testified about the manipulation, the pressure, the gradual erosion of my autonomy that had preceded the accident. Margaret testified about what she'd observed during her visit. The insurance investigator explained the inconsistencies that had triggered the investigation. Medical professionals confirmed that my injuries were consistent with being pushed rather than falling accidentally. Marcus was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The judge specifically noted the calculated nature of his crimes and the breach of trust involved in targeting his own vulnerable parent for financial exploitation. Elena flew in for the sentencing, devastated by the revelation of her brother's crimes but supportive of my decision to pursue justice. She'd known about his financial problems but had never imagined he would resort to violence against family members to solve them. We grieved together for the son and brother we'd thought we knew, while acknowledging that the person we'd loved might never have truly existed. In the months that followed, I began the process of rebuilding my life on my own terms. I recovered fully from my injuries, returned to driving, and resumed many of the activities Marcus had discouraged as being too dangerous for someone of my age and condition. I kept the house Richard and I had shared, making modifications for safety and accessibility, but refusing to let fear dictate my choices about where and how to live. Most importantly, I reclaimed my agency. The experience had shown me how easy it is to gradually surrender control of your life to someone who claims to have your best interests at heart, how manipulation can masquerade as care, how family loyalty can be weaponized against family members. I'd learned to trust my instincts, seek independent advice, and question narratives that served others' interests better than my own. Detective Chen stayed in touch, occasionally calling to check on my well-being, and to let me know about other cases where her investigation into Marcus had provided leads. Apparently, elder abuse and financial exploitation were more common than I'd realized, often perpetrated by adult children who felt entitled to their parents' assets and justified in accelerating their inheritance through manipulation or violence. Margaret visited regularly, and our friendship deepened through the shared experience of navigating family crisis and legal proceedings. She'd been right that trusting my instincts was crucial, that recognizing manipulation doesn't make you paranoid or ungrateful, and that protecting yourself from exploitation is a form of self-respect rather than family disloyalty. I also discovered that surviving Marcus's betrayal had given me a different kind of strength. I'd faced the worst possible violation of trust from someone I'd loved unconditionally, and I'd not only survived but emerged with a clearer understanding of my own worth and capabilities. The experience had been devastating, but it had also been liberating in ways I hadn't expected. Sometimes people ask me if I regret pursuing the investigation and prosecution, if the cost to our family was worth the principle of justice. My answer is always the same. Marcus made his choices when he decided to see me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. I made mine when I decided that my life had value beyond what it could provide for someone else's benefit. The house is quiet now, but it's a peaceful quiet rather than the oppressive silence that had preceded the accident. I've made new friends, pursued interests that Marcus had discouraged, and discovered that independence at 75 looks different than I'd expected, but is no less precious for being delayed. Richard would be proud of how I handled the crisis, proud that the woman he'd married was still capable of fighting for herself when fighting was necessary. Every morning, I walked down to the basement to do laundry or retrieve items from storage, and I remember the moment when I realized someone I trusted had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. But I also remember that I survived, that I recognized what was happening, and that I had the courage to seek help and demand justice. That's the story I tell myself now, not the story of being a victim, but the story of becoming a survivor. Not the story of family loyalty turned toxic, but the story of learning to value myself enough to protect what remained of my life from those who would exploit it. Marcus will be eligible for parole in 8 years. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, if there will be apologies or attempts at reconciliation, but I know that whatever happens, I'll be making that decision from a position of strength rather than vulnerability, with full knowledge of what he's capable of and what I'm worth. The insurance company eventually paid out my claim, acknowledging that while Marcus had committed fraud, my injuries were real and my medical expenses legitimate. I used part of the settlement to make my house safer and more accessible, part to establish an emergency fund that would give me options if I ever needed care, and part to support organizations that help other elderly people recognize and escape from exploitation. Detective Chen told me that my case had become part of training materials for investigators and social workers, an example of how financial elder abuse often escalates to physical violence when manipulation alone proves insufficient. She said that my willingness to pursue charges despite family pressure had likely prevented Marcus from victimizing others, that people like him rarely stop with their first successful exploitation. That knowledge doesn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it does give meaning to the pain. Richard used to say that experience becomes wisdom only when you're willing to learn from it and share those lessons with others who might benefit. I've learned that love without boundaries becomes enabling, that family loyalty can become a weapon in the wrong hands, and that protecting yourself from exploitation is sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. Most of all, I've learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, to prioritize your own well-being, to refuse to be diminished by others' expectations or limitations. Marcus thought he was dealing with a confused, vulnerable old woman who could be easily manipulated through guilt and false concern. Instead, he encountered someone who still had fight left in her, who valued her own life enough to defend it against anyone who tried to treat it as disposable. That's who I choose to be now, not despite what happened, but because of it. Strong enough to live alone, but wise enough to maintain connections. Independent enough to make my own decisions, but humble enough to seek advice when I need it. Loving enough to remember the good parts of my relationship with Marcus, while realistic enough to accept the truth about who he became. The basement stairs have been rebuilt with better lighting, non-slip surfaces, and a sturdy handrail that I test every time I use it. But more importantly, I've rebuilt my confidence in my own judgment, my trust in my ability to recognize danger, and my certainty that my life has value beyond what it can provide for others. Sometimes I think about the alternate timeline where I hadn't questioned the accident, where I'd accepted Marcus's narrative and moved to assisted living, gradually surrendering more control until I existed only as a source of resources for his benefit. That version of my story would have ended very differently, with my death providing the final financial solution to his problems. Instead, I'm sitting in my own living room, in the house Richard and I shared for nearly 4 decades, planning my next day and my next year, with the freedom that comes from having faced the worst and discovered that I was strong enough to survive it. That's not the story Marcus thought he was writing when he loosened those screws in my basement stair railing. The phone call from Detective Chen came on a Tuesday morning while I was tending to the small herb garden I'd planted in the sunny corner of my backyard. The basil was thriving, its leaves thick and fragrant in the late summer heat, and I was cutting stems for the pasta sauce I planned to make for dinner. Simple pleasures had taken on new meaning since the trial, each ordinary moment feeling like a small victory over the future Marcus had tried to steal from me. "Mrs. Coleman, I have some news about your son that I thought you should hear directly from me rather than through other channels." Detective Chen's voice carried that careful professional tone she used when delivering information that might be difficult to process. "Marcus has been injured in prison, he's alive, but he's in critical condition at the county medical center." I set down my pruning shears and sat heavily on the wooden bench Richard had built beneath our old apple tree. The bench where I'd sat countless evenings watching our children play in the yard, where Richard and I had shared morning coffee on weekend mornings, where I'd been sitting the day Detective Chen first arrived to investigate the insurance inconsistencies. The familiar surface felt solid beneath me as the world seemed to tilt slightly. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the details. "There was an altercation in the prison dining hall. Another inmate attacked him with a homemade weapon. Marcus suffered severe head trauma and internal bleeding. He's undergone multiple surgeries, but the doctors are uncertain about his long-term prognosis. There may be permanent brain damage." The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had tried to cause me head trauma by staging my fall down the basement stairs, and now he was lying in a hospital bed with the very type of injuries he'd hoped to inflict on me. The universe had a dark sense of justice, it seemed, though I took no satisfaction in the symmetry. "Does he have anyone else listed as emergency contact?" I found myself asking, even as I wondered why I cared about his medical advocacy when he'd shown such disregard for mine. "You're still listed as his primary emergency contact and healthcare proxy. His ex-wife declined to be involved when the prison contacted her, and his current girlfriend hasn't responded to repeated attempts to reach her. The hospital needs someone to make medical decisions if his condition deteriorates further." Healthcare proxy. I'd forgotten about that document, signed years ago when Marcus was going through his first divorce and worried about his ex-wife making vindictive decisions if something happened to him. I'd agreed to serve as his medical advocate in emergencies, never imagining that someday I'd be making decisions for someone who'd tried to kill me for insurance money. "I need some time to think about this," I told Detective Chen. "Can you give me the hospital's contact information? I'll call them directly once I've decided how to proceed." After hanging up, I remained on the garden bench for a long time, watching bees work among the flowers Richard had planted along the fence line. Cosmos and zinnias, marigolds and sunflowers, chosen more for their ability to attract pollinators than for any particular aesthetic appeal. Richard had believed in supporting the ecosystem, in creating spaces where other living things could thrive alongside us. What would Richard have wanted me to do about Marcus? My husband had been a forgiving man, slow to anger, and quick to find explanations for others' bad behavior that allowed him to maintain relationships even when he'd been hurt or disappointed. But he'd also been practical, unwilling to enable destructive patterns or ignore evidence that conflicted with his hopes about people he cared about. I thought about the recordings Detective Chen had discovered, Marcus discussing with his business partner how much money my death would generate and how quickly they could access it once the insurance paid out. I thought about the careful planning that had gone into staging my accident, the research he'd done into insurance fraud techniques, the way he'd documented my supposed mental decline to support his eventual guardianship petition. Then I thought about the little boy who'd cried when I'd had to euthanize his injured bird, who'd insisted on holding a funeral for every pet that died, who'd told me at age 7 that he never wanted me to be sad because my sad face made his heart hurt. Where had that child gone? When had empathy been replaced by calculation, love by exploitation? Margaret called that evening, as she did most Tuesday evenings since the trial. She'd become my informal advisor, an emotional support system, the person I could speak with honestly about the ongoing aftermath of Marcus's betrayal, without worrying about being judged for my conflicted feelings. I told her about Detective Chen's call and the decision I now faced about Marcus's medical care. Margaret listened without interruption, a skill she'd developed during her years as a single mother managing crisis after crisis, with limited resources and no backup support. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked when I'd finished explaining the situation. "My gut tells me that he's still my son, regardless of what he did to me, and that letting him die without medical advocacy would make me the kind of person I don't want to be," I said slowly. "But my brain tells me that he's demonstrated he sees me as a source of money, rather than a person worthy of care, and that putting myself in a position to make life and death decisions for him is setting myself up for more trauma." Margaret was quiet for several minutes. Finally she said, "There's a third option you haven't mentioned. You could agree to serve as his medical proxy, but limit your involvement to ensuring he receives appropriate care, rather than taking on the emotional burden of being his loving mother making decisions from the heart." I wasn't sure I understood the distinction she was making. "You could approach this as a practical matter, rather than an emotional one," she explained. Make medical decisions based on what competent healthcare professionals recommend, rather than what you think he deserves, or what would make you feel better about your relationship with him. Treat it like you're advocating for a stranger, who happens to be your legal responsibility. The idea had merit. I could fulfill my legal obligations without reopening emotional wounds that had barely begun to heal. I could ensure Marcus received appropriate medical care without pretending that our relationship was anything other than what his actions had made it, a legal connection severed from emotional trust or family loyalty. The next morning, I called the hospital and spoke with the social worker handling Marcus's case. She explained his condition in detail, the extent of his injuries, the various treatment options available, and the decisions that would need to be made over the coming days and weeks.
His brain swelling was severe but not necessarily permanent, she said. The surgery to relieve pressure had been successful, but recovery would be lengthy and uncertain. I agreed to serve as his healthcare proxy, but requested that all communication go through the hospital's social work department rather than directly to me. I would make decisions based on medical recommendations and established protocols rather than personal preferences or family considerations. I would not visit him, would not provide emotional support, and would not engage with any attempts he might make to contact me once he recovered sufficiently to communicate. The social worker seemed surprised by the formality of my approach, but she accepted my parameters without argument. She'd probably encountered enough family dysfunction in her work to recognize that sometimes maintaining boundaries was more important than maintaining traditional relationships. Over the following weeks, I received periodic updates about Marcus's condition. The brain swelling had decreased, and he'd regained consciousness, though with significant cognitive impairment that might or might not improve with time. He'd lost most of his short-term memory and had difficulty with basic tasks like speaking clearly or recognizing people. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his physical recovery but uncertain about his mental capabilities. The irony was profound and unsettling. Marcus had tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could gain control of my assets, and now he was facing genuine cognitive impairment that might leave him dependent on others for basic care. The universe had granted him the very condition he'd tried to falsely impose on me, complete with the loss of autonomy and decision-making capacity he'd planned to steal from me. But unlike Marcus, I had no intention of exploiting his vulnerability for financial gain. When the social worker asked about his long-term care arrangements, I researched appropriate facilities based on medical needs and insurance coverage rather than cost or convenience to me. When she asked about his personal belongings, I arranged for them to be donated to charity rather than sorting through them for items of value. I treated him exactly as I would have wanted to be treated if our positions had been reversed, with dignity and respect for his medical needs, even though he'd shown neither dignity nor respect for mine. It was the difference between justice and revenge, between maintaining my principles and descending to his level of calculated exploitation. Elena called frequently during this period, struggling with her own conflicted feelings about her brother's situation. She'd been devastated to learn about his crimes against me, but his current vulnerability reactivated her protective instincts as his older sister. She wanted to help him but didn't know how to reconcile that impulse with the knowledge of what he'd done. "I don't know how to feel about this," she admitted during one of our conversations. "Part of me thinks he's getting what he deserves, and part of me thinks that's a horrible way to think about my own brother. Part of me wants to rush to his bedside, and part of me never wants to see him again." "Those conflicted feelings are normal," I told her. "Love doesn't disappear overnight just because someone betrays you, but trust, once broken, is much harder to rebuild. You don't have to choose between loving him and holding him accountable for his actions." Elena decided to visit Marcus once his condition stabilized, not to reconcile or forgive, but to see for herself what his current reality looked like. She flew in for a weekend and spent 2 hours at his bedside, trying to gauge his cognitive capacity and understand his prognosis. "He doesn't remember trying to hurt you," she told me afterward. "He doesn't remember the trial or the prison sentence. According to his doctors, he may never recover those memories, which might be a mercy for both of you. But he also doesn't remember basic things about his life, about his children, about the choices that led him to where he is now." In some ways, the Marcus who had planned my accident no longer existed. brain injury had erased the calculating, manipulative man who had seen me as a problem to be solved, leaving behind someone who required care rather than someone who exploited others' need for care. But it had also erased whatever capacity for remorse or accountability he might have developed, whatever possibility for genuine apology or meaningful redemption. The prison system eventually transferred Marcus to a medical facility for inmates requiring long-term care, a decision that removed the immediate pressure on me to make ongoing healthcare decisions. His sentence would be served in a setting appropriate to his current cognitive capacity, under medical supervision but still within the correctional system. I felt relief when the hospital social worker called to inform me that my role as healthcare proxy was concluding. I'd fulfilled my legal and ethical obligations without compromising my emotional recovery or reopening wounds that needed to remain closed. I'd ensured he received appropriate care without pretending our relationship could return to what it had been before his betrayal. But the experience had raised questions about forgiveness and justice that I continued to wrestle with long after Marcus's case was resolved. What did I owe someone who had tried to kill me for money? What was the difference between compassion and enabling? How do you maintain your humanity when responding to someone who had discarded theirs? Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist I'd started seeing after the trial, helped me work through these complex ethical and emotional questions. She specialized in trauma recovery for elderly adults who had experienced abuse by family members, and she understood the particular challenges of maintaining mental health while navigating betrayal by someone you'd loved and trusted unconditionally. Forgiveness isn't about absolving someone of responsibility for their actions, she explained during one of our sessions. It's about releasing your own attachment to anger and resentment so those emotions don't continue to harm you. You can forgive Marcus for your own peace of mind, without excusing what he did or pretending your relationship can be restored. I'd been carrying anger like a weight in my chest, a constant presence that colored every interaction and decision. The anger wasn't entirely negative, it had motivated me to seek justice and protect myself from further exploitation, but it was also exhausting to maintain and limiting in terms of my ability to move forward. Working with Dr. Martinez, I began to separate my anger about Marcus's actions from my anger about their impact on my sense of safety and trust. I could acknowledge that what he'd done was unforgivable, while also acknowledging that continuing to carry rage about it was harming my own well-being more than it was harming him. The process was neither quick nor linear. Some days I felt compassionate toward the brain-injured man in the medical facility who no longer remembered trying to kill me. Other days I felt furious about the calculated betrayal and manipulation that had preceded my accident. Most days I felt some combination of both, along with grief for the relationship we'd never be able to repair, and the son I'd thought I'd raised, but who had apparently never truly existed. Margaret remained my most consistent source of practical wisdom during this period. She'd experienced her own betrayals by family members, situations where people she'd trusted had prioritized their own interests over her well-being, and she understood the long process of rebuilding confidence in your own judgment after discovering you'd been systematically deceived. The hardest part isn't forgiving them, she told me during one of our long phone conversations. The hardest part is forgiving yourself for not seeing it coming, for being vulnerable to someone who was planning to exploit that vulnerability. You keep wondering what signs you missed, what you should have done differently, how you could have been so blind to someone's true nature. She was right. I'd been replaying memories of my interactions with Marcus, looking for clues I should have recognized, warning signs I should have heeded. The way he'd asked detailed questions about my insurance policies. The way he'd encouraged me to rely on him for tasks I could have managed myself. The way he'd documented my minor forgetfulness as evidence of cognitive decline. But Dr. Martinez helped me understand that recognizing manipulation in hindsight was much easier than recognizing it in real time, especially when it was being perpetrated by someone you loved and trusted. Marcus had been skilled at gradual encroachment, at framing his control as care, at making his agenda seem like it was in my best interests. You trusted your son because that's what mothers do, she said. The failure wasn't in your judgment, the failure was in his character. You responded to his behavior as if he was acting in good faith, because you had no reason to believe otherwise. That's not naivety. That's normal human trust within family relationships. Slowly, I began to rebuild my confidence in my ability to recognize genuine care versus manipulative control. I practiced setting boundaries with well-meaning friends who offered unsolicited advice about my living situation. I learned to distinguish between my actual limitations and the limitations others tried to impose on me out of their own anxiety about aging and independence. Most importantly, I rediscovered my own agency. The accident and its aftermath had temporarily convinced me that I was vulnerable and dependent, that I needed others to make decisions and provide protection. But surviving Marcus's betrayal and manipulation had actually demonstrated the opposite. I was capable of recognizing danger, seeking help, and taking action to protect myself even under extremely difficult circumstances. The house felt different now, not just because Marcus no longer had access to it, but because I no longer saw it through his eyes as a burden or liability. It was my sanctuary again, the place where Richard and I had built our life together, where I could continue building whatever life remained to me on my own terms. I made changes, some practical and some symbolic. I replaced the security cameras Marcus had installed with a simpler system that made me feel safe without feeling surveilled. I converted his old bedroom into a craft room where I could pursue hobbies I'd abandoned during the years of caregiving and grief. I planted new flowers in the garden, varieties chosen for my own pleasure rather than their appeal to prospective buyers. The basement got a complete renovation. I couldn't bear to go down there for months after the accident, but eventually I realized that avoiding the space was giving Marcus's manipulation ongoing power over my daily life. I hired contractors to install better lighting, non-slip flooring, and a chairlift for the stairs. I reclaimed the space as my laundry room and storage area rather than letting it remain a site of trauma. Each change felt like an act of defiance against the future Marcus had tried to impose on me. He'd seen the house as outdated and inconvenient, requiring expensive maintenance that would drain my resources. I saw it as a space I could modify to meet my changing needs while preserving the memories and connections that made it home. The financial impact of the whole ordeal had been significant, but not devastating. Legal fees, medical expenses not covered by insurance, and the cost of home modifications had consumed a substantial portion of my savings, but I still had enough resources to maintain my independence for the foreseeable future. More importantly, I'd learned to manage my own finances rather than relying on others to handle transactions and decisions I was perfectly capable of making myself. I hired a fee-only financial planner, someone who was paid for advice rather than commission on products, to help me develop a long-term strategy for managing my assets as I aged. We discussed various scenarios for future care needs, from minor assistance with household tasks to full-time medical support, and developed flexible plans that would allow me to maintain as much autonomy as possible regardless of how my health evolved. The process was empowering rather than frightening. Instead of being told what I should do by someone with their own agenda, I was learning about options and making informed decisions based on my own priorities and preferences. I was planning for my future rather than having it planned for me by others who might not have my best interests at heart. Elena visited more frequently now, partly out of concern about my well-being, and partly because Marcus's incapacitation had shifted family dynamics in ways that required adjustment. She'd always been the responsible older sister, but Marcus's role as the local family member who handled practical issues had disappeared, leaving her to provide long-distance support and occasional hands-on assistance. But our relationship had also deepened through the shared experience of recognizing and responding to Marcus's betrayal. Elena had been forced to confront the reality that her brother was capable of violence against family members, that his financial pressures had overridden any loyalty or affection he might have felt for me. The knowledge had shattered some of her assumptions about family bonds and unconditional love, but it had also strengthened her commitment to maintaining honest, supportive relationships with the family members who remained trustworthy. We talked more openly now about difficult topics we'd previously avoided. Elena's concerns about her own children's character development, given what they'd witnessed about their uncle's behavior. My fears about becoming a burden to her as I aged, and her fears about recognizing if I ever did need more support than I was willing to acknowledge. The challenges of maintaining independence while accepting appropriate help, and the difference between reasonable caution and paralyzing anxiety about aging. These conversations would have been impossible before Marcus's betrayal forced us to confront the reality that family relationships required ongoing attention and honest communication rather than assumptions about automatic loyalty and care. We'd both learned that love without boundaries could become enabling, and that protecting ourselves from exploitation was sometimes the most loving thing we could do for everyone involved. The ripple effects of Marcus's crimes extended beyond immediate family members. His former clients had to find new financial advisors when his conviction became public knowledge. His business partner faced investigation for potential complicity in the insurance fraud, though charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence. His ex-wife had to explain to their children why their father was in prison and what his crimes meant for their relationship with him going forward. I felt some responsibility for these collateral consequences, even though I knew intellectually that Marcus's choices had created them rather than my decision to report his crimes. Dr. Martinez helped me work through the guilt I felt about the impact on innocent parties, particularly Marcus's children who had lost their father to his own criminal behavior. "You didn't destroy Marcus's relationships with his children," she reminded me repeatedly. "He did that when he chose to commit crimes that would send him to prison. You didn't ruin his business reputation. He did that when he chose to use his position to commit fraud. The consequences he's experiencing are the natural result of his actions, not punishment you imposed on him." Understanding the distinction intellectually was easier than accepting it emotionally, but gradually I internalized the reality that seeking justice for crimes committed against me wasn't the same as seeking revenge. Marcus had chosen to prioritize his financial problems over my safety and well-being. I had chosen to prioritize my own protection and the rule of law over family loyalty. Both choices had consequences, but only one of them had been criminal.
As Marcus's first year in the medical facility passed, I began to receive occasional updates about his condition from Elena, who had maintained sporadic contact with his medical team. His physical recovery had progressed better than initially expected, but his cognitive impairment remained severe. He could carry on simple conversations and perform basic self-care tasks, but he couldn't manage complex decisions or retain new information for more than a few hours. In some ways, the brain injury had created the mental incapacity Marcus had tried to falsely impose on me. He now genuinely needed the kind of supervision and advocacy he'd claimed I required, the difference being that his need was real and mine had been fabricated for his financial benefit. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't provide the satisfaction I might have expected. Watching anyone lose their mental faculties was tragic, even when that person had been planning to exploit my supposed mental decline for their own advantage. Brain injury was a medical tragedy, not a form of cosmic justice, regardless of how poetic the symmetry might seem. Elena struggled more than I did with the moral complexity of Marcus's situation. She felt guilty for feeling relieved that his cognitive impairment meant he couldn't continue manipulating family members or committing crimes against vulnerable people. She felt conflicted about mourning the loss of the brother she'd thought she knew while simultaneously feeling safer knowing he was no longer capable of the calculating behavior that had endangered me. "He's like a different person now," she told me after one of her visits to the medical facility. "Not better or worse, necessarily, just fundamentally different. The Marcus who planned your accident doesn't exist anymore, but neither does the Marcus who used to call me every week to check on my kids, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who could make me laugh when I was having a bad day." Brain injury had erased both the criminal and the caring aspects of Marcus's personality, leaving behind someone who required care but was incapable of providing it, someone who needed protection but posed no threat to others. It was a profound loss for everyone who had loved him, even as it eliminated the danger he had represented to vulnerable family members. I found myself grieving not for the person Marcus had become, but for the person I'd believed him to be before discovering his true nature. The loving son who had never actually existed, the protective family member who had actually been a predator, the trustworthy person who had been systematically planning my exploitation. That grief was complicated by anger, relief, and confusion, but it was genuine mourning for the relationship I'd thought we had. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that it was normal to grieve the loss of illusions about people we'd loved, even when reality was safer than the illusion had been.
I'd loved Marcus deeply, but I'd been loving a carefully constructed persona rather than his authentic self. Discovering his true character had been devastating, but it had also freed me from the danger of continued manipulation and exploitation. The second anniversary of my accident passed quietly. I marked the date by visiting Richard's grave and telling him about everything that had happened since his death, the betrayal and the investigation and the trial and the aftermath. I brought flowers from our garden, the same varieties he'd planted for the bees, and sat by his headstone for an hour talking through my complicated feelings about our son and our marriage and my plans for whatever years remained to me. I think you would have seen through Marcus's manipulation faster than I did, I told Richard's headstone. You always were better at recognizing when someone was trying to sell us something we didn't need. But I also think you would have struggled with the decision to have him prosecuted, because you always believed people could change if given enough chances. Richard had been an optimist about human nature, sometimes to his own detriment. He'd continued lending money to his brother long after it became clear the loans would never be repaid. He'd maintained friendships with people who took advantage of his generosity without offering reciprocal support. He'd believed that love and patience could eventually reach anyone, that people's better angels would ultimately triumph over their selfish impulses. But he'd also been practical about protecting what mattered most to him. When his brother's drinking had begun affecting family gatherings, Richard had set boundaries about visits and alcohol consumption. When a business partner had tried to cheat him, Richard had ended the relationship and pursued legal remedies. He'd known the difference between giving people chances to improve and enabling behavior that was harmful to others. I think he would have supported my decision to report Marcus's crimes, even while grieving the necessity of that choice. Richard had raised Marcus to understand right from wrong, to take responsibility for his actions, to treat other people with respect and care. Marcus's betrayal hadn't just been a crime against me, it had been a repudiation of everything Richard had tried to teach him about character and integrity. Sitting in the cemetery, surrounded by evidence of lives completed and relationships that had endured until natural death, I felt a sense of perspective about my own situation. Richard and I had had 47 years together, mostly good years filled with love and partnership and shared goals. Marcus had stolen 2 years from me, the time between Richard's death and the resolution of the criminal case, but he hadn't stolen the decades of happiness that had preceded his betrayal. More importantly, he hadn't succeeded in stealing my future. I was 77 years old, living independently, managing my own affairs, making my own decisions about how to spend whatever time remained to me. The future he'd tried to impose on me, confined to assisted living while he liquidated my assets, had been prevented by my recognition of the manipulation and my willingness to seek help from outside the family. I drove home from the cemetery feeling lighter than I had in months, not because I'd forgiven Marcus or achieved some kind of closure, but because I'd reminded myself that his betrayal was only one chapter in a much longer story. The story of my marriage, my motherhood, my friendships, my interests, my contributions to my community. Marcus had tried to write the ending to that story for his own benefit, but the actual ending remained to be written by me. That evening I called Margaret and Elena to share my reflections from the cemetery visit. Both of them had been worried about me as the anniversary approached, knowing that milestone dates often triggered complicated emotions and memories. But I was able to tell them honestly that I felt more peaceful than I'd expected, more focused on the future than trapped in the past. I've been thinking about taking a trip, I told them. Maybe visiting some places Richard and I always talked about seeing but never got around to. I've got the time, the health, and the resources to travel, and I think I'd like to create some new memories to balance out the difficult ones from the past few years. Elena immediately offered to accompany me on any trips I wanted to take, worried about my safety traveling alone at my age. But I found myself wanting to experience the independence of solo travel, to prove to myself that I was capable of managing unfamiliar situations and making decisions without consulting anyone else about my preferences or capabilities. Margaret understood this impulse better than Elena did. She'd done a lot of solo traveling in the years after her husband's death, partly for practical reasons, but mostly because she'd needed to rediscover her own identity separate from her role as wife and mother. She'd learned that she was capable of handling unexpected challenges, comfortable with her own company, and interested in experiences her husband wouldn't have chosen, but that appealed to her own tastes and curiosities. Solo travel at our age isn't reckless, she assured Elena during one of our three-way phone conversations. It's liberating. Your mother has spent the past few years having other people make assumptions about her capabilities and limitations. Choosing her own adventures is exactly what she needs to rebuild confidence in her own judgment and independence. I planned a modest first trip, a long weekend in Charleston, South Carolina, a city Richard and I had discussed visiting but never prioritized. I booked my own flights and hotel, researched restaurants and historic sites that interested me, and packed for 3 days of exploring at my own pace, without having to accommodate anyone else's schedule or preferences. The trip was revelatory. I walked for hours through historic neighborhoods, sat in beautiful gardens reading books I'd chosen without consulting anyone else's opinion, ate meals at restaurants that appealed to me without worrying whether anyone else would enjoy them. I struck up conversations with other travelers, attended a lecture at the local historical society, and spent an entire afternoon in a museum that Richard would have found boring but that I found fascinating. Most importantly, I handled the small challenges that arose without assistance or anxiety. When my flight was delayed, I rearranged my schedule calmly and found ways to occupy my time at the airport. When I got lost walking back to my hotel, I asked for directions and enjoyed discovering a different route through the city. When a restaurant I'd planned to visit was closed unexpectedly, I found another option that turned out to be even better. These were minor accomplishments, the kind of problem solving that most adults take for granted, but they felt significant to me because they demonstrated that I was fully capable of managing my own life without oversight or protection from family members who might not have my best interests at heart. I was competent, independent, and resilient, qualities Marcus had tried to convince everyone I lacked. The trip also reminded me that I had interests and preferences separate from my roles as wife and mother, aspects of my personality that had been overshadowed during the caregiving years and the aftermath of Richard's death. I enjoyed architecture, local history, regional cuisine, and the stories other travelers shared about their own adventures. I was curious about places I'd never seen and cultures I'd never experienced. When I returned home, I began planning more trips. A week in New Mexico to visit art galleries and archaeological sites. A cruise through the Panama Canal with stops in countries I'd only read about in books. A photography workshop in the Pacific Northwest focused on landscape and wildlife. Adventures Richard wouldn't have chosen, but that appealed to interests I'd developed independently of his preferences. Elena was initially anxious about my travel plans, worried about my safety and the practical challenges of solo travel at my age. But as she saw how energized and confident I became after each trip, she began to understand that my wandering wasn't reckless behavior but healthy recovery from the trauma of Marcus's betrayal and the grief of Richard's death. "You seem like yourself again," she told me after I returned from the photography workshop with dozens of pictures and stories about the people I'd met. "Not the person you were when Dad was alive, but the person you might have been if circumstances had been different. More adventurous, more curious, more willing to take risks for the sake of new experiences." She was right. The woman who had emerged from the crisis with Marcus was different from the person I'd been during my marriage, not because I loved Richard less, but because I'd rediscovered aspects of my identity that had been dormant during the decades of partnership and family responsibility. I was still a widow and a mother, but I was also an independent traveler, a curious learner, and a survivor of circumstances that could have destroyed my confidence and autonomy. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, periods of anger and grief that seemed overwhelming. But gradually, with the support of people like Margaret and Dr. Martinez and Elena, I'd rebuilt my sense of self on a foundation that couldn't be undermined by someone else's manipulation or exploitation. Marcus had tried to convince everyone that I was becoming incompetent and dependent, that I needed others to make decisions and provide care. Instead, his betrayal had forced me to develop greater competence and independence, to learn skills I'd never needed during my marriage, to trust my own judgment even when others questioned it. The house that he'd seen as too much responsibility for an aging widow had become the base for adventures he'd never imagined I was capable of undertaking. The assets he'd planned to liquidate for his own benefit were funding experiences that enriched my life and broadened my perspective. The future he'd tried to steal from me had become more interesting and fulfilling than anything I'd planned when Richard was alive, and we thought we had decades left to explore the world together. Sometimes people asked me if I thought Marcus had learned anything from his experience, if brain injury and imprisonment had given him insight into the harm he'd caused or remorse for his actions. The honest answer was that I didn't know and had stopped caring about his internal experience. Marcus's potential for growth or redemption was between him and whatever remained of his conscience. My responsibility was to my own recovery and my own future, not to his moral education or emotional development. He'd forfeited any claim on my concern or forgiveness when he'd chosen to see me as prey rather than family. What mattered now was what I'd learned about myself, my capabilities, and my resilience. I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd known, more resourceful than I'd been given credit for, and more deserving of respect and autonomy than the people who'd tried to manage my life had recognized. I'd learned that aging didn't have to mean accepting diminished agency or surrendering decision-making authority to others. I could adapt to changing physical capabilities without accepting mental or emotional limitations imposed by other people's anxieties about growing older. I could acknowledge my vulnerabilities while still asserting my right to take reasonable risks and make independent choices. Most importantly, I'd learned that survival could become transformation, that crisis could become opportunity, and that the worst experiences could sometimes lead to the most authentic and fulfilling periods of life. Marcus had tried to write the final chapters of my story for his own benefit, but instead his betrayal had given me the motivation and opportunity to write those chapters myself, on my own terms, with adventures he'd never imagined, and strength he'd never recognized. That was his greatest failure, and my ultimate victory. He'd planned to diminish me, and instead he'd forced me to discover just how much life I still had left to live. 5 years have passed since that terrible day in my basement. Marcus remains in the medical facility, his sentence continuing despite his diminished capacity. I've stopped asking for updates about his condition. Today I'm packing for Iceland, my 13th solo adventure since discovering my independence. The woman who once needed permission to change her own locks now navigates foreign countries with confidence. Elena visits monthly, amazed at my transformation. Margaret and I travel together occasionally, two survivors who understand that the best revenge against those who tried to diminish us is living fully. My house stays exactly as I want it. No more suggestions about what's practical or appropriate for my age. The basement renovation is complete, now a bright space where I store travel souvenirs instead of avoiding painful memories. Sometimes neighbors ask about Marcus. I tell them simply that he made his choices and faced the consequences. I don't waste energy explaining the complexities to people who weren't there. The insurance settlement paid for home improvements and adventures. Every trip, every modification, every independent decision is funded by money he thought would be his through my death or incapacity. Justice took an unexpected form, but it was thorough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.